The town of Ingleswood was in the middle of nowhere, according to the map. I'd never heard of it before, and neither had any of my friends when I'd asked them before leaving. Even more strange was receiving correspondence from a relative I hadn't spoken to since I was a young child. It had come out of nowhere, a letter, proclaiming my great-uncle to be dead, and informing me that I had inherited a slaughterhouse in a town I had never even heard of. A slaughterhouse, of all things. I might have thought it was a prank had there not been a rusted metal key included in the letter. Somehow, part of me knew the key was real, and that it belonged to the slaughterhouse my great-uncle had once owned. The ownership had been passed on to me, for reasons as of yet unknown, and I would have to drive up there in order to settle the inheritance. Which is why I was currently driving down a long, serpentine road through a dense cluster of trees. It was still early afternoon, but the sky was gray and heavy, casting a dismal pall over the forest. Shadows crept out of the trees and onto the road, making it difficult to see without my headlamps. I shuffled forward in my seat, hands gripping the wheel tighter as the trees grew around me. I'd been driving for just over 3 hours now, and it had been at least 30 minutes since I'd last seen another car. According to my map, should be almost there. Yet I hadn't seen any sign of civilization. Nothing but empty fields and abandoned, ramshackle buildings in the middle of nowhere, and now this forest that seemed endless and labyrinthine. The tires hit something in the road, and the car jerked, throwing me forward in my seat. I slammed my foot on the brakes and the car skidded to a stop, gravel hissing beneath the tires. I glanced into my rearview and spied a shadow on the road, but I couldn't tell what it was. Had I hit an animal or something? I hadn't seen anything. I debated ignoring it and driving off, but in the end, I cut the engine and climbed out of the car. The air beneath the trees was cold, and goosebumps pricked the back of my neck as I walked over to the misshapen lump on the road. The smell hit me first. The smell of old rot and blood. It was an animal carcass. A rabbit, perhaps, or something else. It was too mangled and bloodied for me to tell. Flies buzzed around the torn flesh, the gray glint of bone poking beneath the fur. Whatever it was, it had been dead for a while. I stood up and shook my head, lip curling against the stench. I'd move it off the road, but I didn't have anything with me that would do the trick, and I'd rather not touch it without proper protection. I would have to leave it. Maybe carrion birds would come and pick it clean later. I returned to my car, feeling a little bit nauseated, and drove off, watching the dead animal disappear behind me. 15 minutes later and I finally broke free from the forest. Muted gray sunlight parted the clouds, dappling the windscreen. On the other side of the trees were more fields, still empty. I found it odd that there was no cattle around. No sheep or pigs either. What was the use of a slaughterhouse if there was nothing to slaughter? In the distance, I glimpsed a small cluster of buildings. It was more like a settlement than a town. Stone and brick and straw. Not the kind of place I expected to find myself inheriting a building. Had my great-uncle really lived out here in the middle of nowhere? Was that why I have never heard from him? The road turned loose and rutted, and the car jerked and bumped as I drove closer to the town. A small sign, weathered and covered in mud, read, "Welcome to Ingleswood." At least it had a sign. The place wasn't a made-up town after all. I pulled the car to a stop at the side of the road and pulled out my map again. The letter had contained specific coordinates to the slaughterhouse which, according to the map, was a little distance away from the town itself, on the very borders. If I followed the road for a couple more miles, and then took a left, I should arrive at the house. A flutter of nervous energy tightened my stomach. I didn't really know what to expect when I got there, or what I was going to do about the situation. The only reason I'd driven down here was to get a better understanding of things, assess the area, and try and figure out what to do. Should I sell the slaughterhouse, or move here? The latter option didn't sound particularly appealing after getting a glimpse of the area, but I wouldn't know until I had a proper look around. I followed the loose gravel road for a little while longer before spotting a turning off to the left. The remains of a broken stone wall lined the path, and I spotted another sign that was too rusted to read. Signaling to turn, even though there were no other cars in the area, I followed the path through the sheltered, wooded area until I reached a small house. It was more of a cottage, really, with white bricks and a thatched roof. The place had an air of dilapidation about it, as though nobody had lived here in a while. Considering my great-uncle had only passed recently, I knew that wasn't true. Beside the house was a large, freestanding shed. A rusted padlock was chained around the doors, and I knew without a doubt that the key I'd been given was the key to the shed. Did that mean the shed was the slaughterhouse? I parked the car on the grass and climbed out. The air out here was fresh and pleasant, a nice change from the city. Though beneath the fragrance of nature, I could smell something else, something darker, richer. Old blood and rust and butchered meat. I threw a brief glance at my surroundings, my gaze skimmed past the trees and the fields and the faint curl of smoke blotting the distant sky. I couldn't hear anything beyond the wind. No birdsong, no chittering bugs. I couldn't hear cars or people or anything that would suggest there was a town nearby. I let out a sigh. Maybe it would feel lonely living out here. I was used to the city, after all. I grabbed my rucksack from the trunk and fished out the letter and the key I'd been given. No key to the house, which was odd. I'd phoned my great-uncle's executor before driving out here, but apparently all material belongings were still inside the house, and the shed key was the only thing that had been passed on to me directly. I walked up to the cottage's door and tried the handle. Locked, unsurprisingly. If I couldn't figure out a way to get inside, I'd have to call a locksmith out here, which could take hours. Muttering in frustration, I began rooting around the rocks and broken plant pots sitting outside the cottage. Whatever plants had once resided there were now withered and shriveled, their roots black and gnarled as they poked through the soil. I turned one of the empty pots over and grinned, and my eyes caught a glint of silver. I hadn't had my hopes up, so finding the key immediately lifted my spirits. At least now I could get inside the house. Leaving the slaughterhouse locked for now, I headed inside the cottage. The air was stale and heavy with dust, and my eyes immediately started to water. How long had it been since anyone had opened that door? I wasn't familiar with the circumstances of my great-uncle's death, so I wasn't sure if he had spent his last moments in the house or not. That thought made me shudder as my nose picked up on the smell of damp and mold. Apart from some minimal furnishings, the house was mostly bare. I didn't know what kind of man my great-uncle was, but apparently he didn't like clutter, and he very rarely dusted. I ran a finger over the sideboard in the hallway and grimaced at the thick layer of dust clinging to my skin. If I did decide to stay here, it was going to take a lot of work to get this place up to standard. The longer I stayed here, the more I wanted to leave without looking around. But I couldn't ignore it forever. At some point, I'd have to assess the state of the slaughterhouse and make a decision about what to do with it. I went through each room, casting a cursory look over the furniture and testing the electricity and water supply. Everything still seemed to be running, which was a bonus. I'd already planned to stay the night here, so having hot water and lighting would make things easier. Upstairs, I paused on the landing to peer out the window. At the back of the house was a field of brown, uncut grass and some stilted shrubs. I could just see the edge of the shed beside the cottage, the old wood stained and weathered. In the distance, I could see the cluster of houses that formed the village. As I was about to turn away, I glimpsed movement at the edge of the property, amongst the tree-line. Someone stood between the trees, watching me. I couldn't get a good view of their face, but in the brief glance, it seemed gray and hollow, like wax. The figure darted away through the trees and disappeared. I frowned, that unease from earlier returning. Was it a villager? Shaking it off, I searched the upstairs room. A large master bedroom and a bathroom, a linen cupboard and a smaller guest bedroom was all that was up here. Like downstairs, everything up here was old and run down, covered in a thick layer of dust and mildew. I closed the bedroom door behind me and went back down into the kitchen, where I'd left my rucksack. The rusted key to the slaughterhouse sat on the table, where I'd left it. I figured it was about time I went to see what I was dealing with next door. Grabbing the key, I left the house and went across to the shed. The metal of the padlock was ice cold against my fingertips as I inserted the key and twisted it. The lock fell away, and the door edged open with a creak. Shadows spilled out across my feet. I peered into the darkness as I gripped the edge of the door and pulled it open further. The air inside smelled stale and old. That same undercurrent of old blood ran beneath the surface. Drawing in a deep breath, I pushed the door the rest of the way and stepped inside, letting the dull afternoon light filter inside. The slaughterhouse was nothing like I'd been expecting. Inside was nothing but an empty shed. The wood was damp and starting to rot, the ground full of old hay. There was no equipment that you'd expect of a slaughterhouse. No cold room to store the meat. It was just an empty shed. Perhaps it wasn't a functioning slaughterhouse at all. But then why had it been called as such in the inheritance? Something glinted in the sunlight, and I looked up. Several large metal hooks hung from the ceiling. The kind that you hung meat onto. But what was the point, when there was nowhere to prepare it? Unless I was missing something, this was a plain old shed, with some leftover meat hooks still stuck into the ceiling. I raked a hand through my hair and sighed. Was it a waste coming all the way out here? I shook my head. Not a waste. I still had to figure out what to do with this place, now that it was legally mine. Leaving the slaughterhouse, I relocked it and pocketed the key before heading back into the house. It was getting on in the afternoon and I was tired from driving all morning, so I decided to grab a bite to eat while I considered my options. By the time evening had rolled around, I still hadn't made up my mind about this place. There wasn't much merit to staying here if the slaughterhouse couldn't actually be used, and I didn't particularly fancy being stuck in the middle of nowhere. I could sell it, but not as it was. It would take a bit of work to get it into a decent state, and make it appealing to a potential buyer. The final option was to just leave it here gathering dust, but that seemed a waste. I had debated heading to the village to see who lived around here, but after spying that strange figure watching me from the trees, part of me had been reluctant to venture too far from the house. Maybe I'd walk down there in the morning. As dusk grew outside, shadows encroached further into the cottage, and a chill crept into my bones. I turned on most of the lights and went around drawing the curtains to block out the night. I wasn't fond of sleeping in unfamiliar places, so I spread my sleeping bag on the floor of the downstairs sitting room instead of upstairs. Using hot water from the kitchen, I made myself some instant noodles and ate them from the packet, listening to the radiator clank and groan as it rattled to life. Being on my own in a strange house was starting to make me feel a little unsettled, so I turned on the television to fill the silence. Nothing but static burst from the screen, so I switched it off just as quickly. With nothing else to do, I headed to bed early. I nestled into my sleeping bag and spread another blanket over me to ward off the chill, and fell asleep the second my head hit the pillow. I woke up early the next morning to the sound of someone tapping at the window. Blinking away the grogginess in my eyes, I sat up. The room was still dark, shadows lingering around the edges. I reached over to switch on a lamp and stretched the cricks out of my neck from camping out on the floor all night. What was making that noise? The curtains were still drawn, but I could see movement in the gaps around the edges. Climbing stiffly to my feet, I walked over to the window and tentatively pulled the curtain aside, peering out. A beady black eye stared back. It was a crow. Ruffling its ink-black feathers, it tapped its beak 3 more times against the glass before flying away. I watched it go, frowning. Dawn had yet to break, and the sky was still in the clutches of night. According to my watch, it wasn't even 5 a.m. yet. I was awake now, though, so I dragged myself into the kitchen to get some instant coffee on the go. I'd slept right through the night, but I remembered having strange dreams in the midst of it. Dreams about meat and flesh and bloodied metal hooks. No doubt because of the circumstances I'd found myself in. When I returned to the living room, I found the key to the slaughterhouse sitting on top of my rucksack. I thought I'd left it on the kitchen table, and seeing it elsewhere left me momentarily disconcerted. Had I moved it there? I must have. There was nobody else here but me. Maybe I'd slept less well than I'd thought. I didn't trust the pipes enough to have a hot shower, so I changed into a pair of fresh clothes and drank my coffee until it grew light outside. It was another damp, gray day, and the forest was as silent as it had been last night. Wherever that crow had flown off to, it wasn't anywhere close by. Once it was light enough to see by, I grabbed the key to the shed and went outside to investigate. I didn't expect it to look any different, but maybe having had a full night's rest would give me a different kind of insight into what to do with the place. I unlocked the door, letting the padlock and chain fall to the ground with a heavy thump, and pulled it open. Inside was dim, and it took a second for my eyes to adjust. As soon as I glanced inside, I froze, my heart lurching into my throat. The slaughterhouse was no longer empty. Thick slabs of dark meat now hung from the rusted hooks, the air thick with the smell of flesh and blood. What the hell? Where had it come from? Last night, there had been nothing in here. The shed had been locked, and as far as I was aware, the only key to open it was in my possession. How had this meat gotten in here? And who was responsible? I took a step inside, feeling perturbed and perplexed by the discovery. There was just under a dozen chunks of flesh, all lean and expertly cut, glistening red in the morning light. I wasn't familiar with meat in this form, so I couldn't tell which animal it belonged to, but I could tell it had been prepared recently. All of a sudden, I felt unnerved and unsafe. What was going on here? This was supposed to be my property, yet someone had clearly been creeping around here last night, hauling slabs of meat into my shed. I didn't like the thought of it at all. As I tried to sift through my thoughts, I heard approaching footsteps from behind. My heart pulsed faster as I turned around, not sure what to expect. A group of about 20 people were approaching the property from the trees. The first thing I noticed about them was their gauntness. Like that mysterious figure I had seen in the forest, their skin was pallid and their flesh sunken, their clothes hanging like rags off bony shoulders. They looked starved. "Meat," one of the strangers cried, their voice hoarse and brittle. "We have meat again. We have meat again," someone echoed. "We are saved." What? I muttered, stumbling back in surprise as the group of people, presumably from the village, drew closer. "What's going on? You brought us meat. You saved us," the older villager at the front of the mob said, reaching out his hands in a thankful gesture. Before I could do or say anything, the villagers piled into the shed and began removing the meat from the hooks, slinging it over their shoulders with joyful cries. Wait. What are you doing? I blurted, aghast at their actions. The man from before tottered up to me, his eyes sunken and his cheeks hollow. "Thank you. We are so happy the slaughterhouse has a new owner." He seemed about to turn away, so I quickly grabbed his arm, my fingers digging into his flesh. "Wait. What's going on? Where did this meat come from?" A slow smile spread across the man's face, revealing pink, toothless gums. "You don't know? This place is cursed. See?" He pointed into the shed, and I followed his gaze. Fresh meat was starting to grow from the hook, materializing from thin air. The flesh grew and expanded until it was the same size as the others, and one of the villagers quickly removed it from the hook. I stared in bewildered silence, struggling to piece together what I was seeing. What was happening here? Where was the meat coming from? How could it just appear like that? I still don't understand, I finally uttered in a hoarse whisper. It felt like I was in the middle of a dream. Or a nightmare. The hooks give us flesh, the man said. I shook my head. But where does it come from? This flesh, that never stops growing on these hooks, is the flesh of the slaughterhouse's owner. It's your flesh, the man explained, his dark eyes glistening in the dimness. Behind me, meat continued to grow from the hooks, and the villagers continued to harvest it. Am I flesh? I whispered, the words sticking in my throat. What do you mean? I looked down at myself. I was still intact. How could it be my flesh? It's a reproduction of your flesh. This flesh never rots, never goes bad, it is as alive as you are. The man still wasn't making sense. How could it be my flesh? How was any of this possible? These villagers, this place, were crazy. The longer I stayed, the more danger I would be in. I had to leave, as soon as possible. As if reading the thoughts on my face, the man placed a hand on my arm, a warning look in his eye. There are conditions you must follow, however, he said, his voice a low rasp. If you ever leave this town, your bond to this place will be broken, and the flesh will start to rot. My mouth went bone dry, the ground feeling unsteady beneath my feet. You mean? The man nodded. When the meat begins to rot, so do you. Your body will decay, and eventually perish. And we, the ones who rely on your flesh, will starve. You have no choice but to stay here for the rest of your life, and feed us with the flesh from your body. That is your duty, he said, tightening his old, crooked fingers around my arm, there is no escape. You must accept your fate. Or wither away, just like the owner before you.